It's a great day at the Beyond Academic Studios. This is the FutureX Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Abraham. Excited to be with you as we get to visit today with Dr. Paul LeBlanc, who is the visionary leader of Southern New Hampshire University. And I could spend the next 6 minutes or so reading you his bio and telling you about all the accolades. But honestly, if you're in higher ed and you don't know who Paul LeBlanc is, then you probably should check your pulse. I'm not going to waste any time introducing him. His reputation precedes itself. I want to dive right in and use up every moment we have to hear and learn from you, Doc. First question, and actually let me just set the table of what we're going to cover. We're going to talk a little bit about the future of work. I want to hear your vision for the future of learning, and then I want to make sure we get a chance to spend a little bit of time talking about mindset in higher ed and what role does an entrepreneurial mindset play in, and how does this word consensus play into times of existential change? So that's what I want to cover with you. I want to go up to the 10-meter diving board and jump right off. I'd love to hear your perspective on the future of work and what's higher ed's role in preparing people for it.
So here's what I think I would observe, and none of this will be revelatory for your audience. But what do we know? We know that work is changing now at a ferocious velocity. So even if you don't change your job is changing out from under you every, 2, 3, 4 years. Whose job today looks the same as it did 5 years ago? Not many people. Certainly not in the kind of professions for which we prepare our students, our graduates. We know that work will require increasingly more digital skills. And interestingly, what we have often referred to as soft skills, so critical thinking, meaning making, navigating cultures other than our own, working in teams, emotional intelligence, etc. And yet a lot of our discourse is not, and I would say those are not soft skills. Those are actually the hardest skills. Mm-hmm. And the second thing I would say is that we have so much stress right now on skills as practical and immediate, often kind of, workplace skills, that bigger observation is getting lost. Like, people nod to it. You'll hear, everyone who's talking about workforce will nod to the soft skills, quote unquote, but then spend all their time talking about how do I get more AWS cloud, Salesforce, CRM administrators. I graduated to get them into the workforce. So there's an interesting disconnect that's going on. And then even though we pre-pandemic were at historically low levels of unemployment, you still had enormous anxiety about jobs. And why is that? Because we all see the impending, and it's not even impending, it's happening now, impact of AI, automation, and machine learning. And, there's a lot of talk about robot-proof jobs. And Jamie Marasotis at the Lumen Foundation has an excellent new book, and he uses this term cobot, that we'll all have not just co-workers, but cobots. We'll have algorithmic co-workers. And a lot of us have those already, right? We're marshaling machine learning. So what would you say about that in terms of higher education? We have to be faster, more responsive. We have to rethink curriculum. I think coding boot camps are popular among many critics of higher ed for, among other things, their very direct link to very clear demand signals in the workforce, and the fact that they can change on a dime. That, if a new subroutine in Python is introduced, they'll change their curriculum tomorrow. And then you sort of contrast that, as critics do, with the very long, slow pace of curricular change in universities. So, long answer to your short question, but in this very volatile, fast-changing, technologically situated world of work, having an industrial age model of curriculum design and delivery may not be such a great match, and we're going to have to revisit that.
Okay, you've got me thinking about this whole topic of soft skills. So here's a follow-up to that. What role does higher ed play, or should higher ed play, in developing those soft skills in students?
Well, we played in a couple of ways. Interestingly, those soft skills are more often associated with the humanities. So we tend to think of, critical, like, there's a reason why the top consulting firms, the McKinseys and BCGs of the world and Deloitte's, recruit philosophy majors because they have amazing skills, right? And what are they? They're meaning making, logic, problem solving, language. Those are sought after skills. And yet if you said to someone, hey, my oldest is at college studying philosophy, you might get the typical philosophy, well, where are they going to be flipping burgers? And I think it speaks to a fundamental disconnect between the sort of enduring skills, the skills that sort of take you through the whole of your career, versus a set of immediately applicable skills that will land you a job perhaps more quickly. But we know at this world, those skills are going to be out of date 5 years from now. So to go back to your question, the role of the university is twofold, it seems to me. One is that we have a curricular responsibility to send off into the world graduates who have those, I'm going to call them enduring skills. And then we also have to recognize that for those who have residential campuses, a lot of that skill development happens outside the curriculum, right? So a lot of the skills that employers value happen when students are leading student organizations, captain of their team, study abroad, navigating culture is very different than their own. These are some of the most high-impact practices we make available, and they have a dramatic impact. The other thing I would say is that I think the way I'd like to sort of reframe some of the debates that feel tired to me. So one is, humanities versus pre-professional majors. We absolutely want our engineers and our nurses to have the very specific technical skills that they need, but we should be layering all the way through their learning these enduring skills. So they don't have to be a philosophy major to have really good critical thinking skills. I want my nurse, when confronted with a confounding situation, to have a broader array of skills than simply the very practical technical skills. So we can think about curriculum, I think, in more creative ways than we sometimes do.
Yeah, so for our presidents and provosts and chancellors listening in, it should get the wheels spinning to ask the question, well, where does our curriculum intersect? And how can we be modifying it in the future to better serve these soft skills being embedded in? Can you think of an example that'll make this even more practical for them?
Let me one great example, Joe, where we're working. We know when I talked about how higher education has to be more responsive to changes, the velocity of change in the workforce. Keep in mind that people in the future will be dipping in and out of a learning ecosystem all of their careers, right? Because we all will be constantly relearning, but we're not going to dip in and out for another 2 or 4 year degree. We're going to dip in and out for 2 days of learning, or 2 weeks of learning, or 2 months of learning. So we should see an increasing availability of non-degree credentials. Some people will say more credentials, with a great deal of granularity. And in one such example, we are working with a large company that has many, many engineers on a micro-credential. And what the micro-credential they asked us, and they didn't use this phrase, but I'm going to simplify, that basically we need a micro-credential for our engineering teams to kind of teach them how to talk to humans. Right? So I was like, talk to humans? What do you mean? I was like, well, we have a lot of engineers that when they're dealing with the marketing department or maybe with executives who are not technical, basically repeat more data, only more loudly. And that isn't sort of working. They need to sort of think about how to make people understand what they're working on, help people understand what they're working on in different ways. We need them to have a different toolkit. That's one of those quote unquote soft skills, and there's a good example of a bit of micro-credential learning, dipping back into the ecosystem to say, you know what, I'm a really, really well-trained engineer. Got some other skills I need to work on.
So, Dr. LeBlanc, that transitions us really well to our next topic on this notion of this future of learning. What does the future of learning look like for a student? I want to have you contrast maybe 2 different groups. One is the more traditional student getting ready to graduate high school in a few years and will be looking for that 2 to 4 year degree. But then there's also this learner who's going to become a very big part of higher ed, which is this long-time learner who's going to be learning over the next 10, 20, 30 years of their career through these micro-credentials and these other innovative products that higher ed is going to have to build. Talk a little bit about what that learning environment is going to have to be, and what does higher ed have to do? How does higher ed need to think in order to even prepare, in order to even deliver this future of learning? Share some thoughts on that.
Yeah, so much more dynamic with greater options for the ways in which they learn. We have, as an industry, very successfully, by the way, built a kind of what I would call an industrial age model. So it's standardized by and large, and it's a one-size-fits-all. So if you and I were both English majors at Princeton, I wouldn't get into Princeton, Joe, you would. But if we were both English majors at Princeton, we would have an experience that is pretty much the same. It's sort of, we get accepted on Princeton's terms. They don't sort of wrap themselves around or change around us. The English department's not changing its curriculum because Paul LeBlanc is a student there. We now live in an age of much more responsive customization, and I think that may not be a bad phrase, actually, for describing how students, I hope, will experience higher ed in the future. That is, rather than, in some ways I would argue, higher education has sort of built a model around itself. And you get privileged if you're accepted into it, right? And we're not going to change a whole lot around you. You will sort of conform to this intentional community we've built, at least in a residential campus. In the future, what I'd like to see is that we would know so much more about an individual student and then be able to put in front of them, if not personalized learning, that's a stretch, at least more precision learning. I'm going to borrow that phrase from medicine. So more than one option that might be better suited for either the way they learn or their financial circumstances or their time constraints or where they are in their life. For example, the needs of a 17-year-old coming out of high school include a whole lot of developmental coming of age, right? Kind of finding out who they are, what they're about, etc. The needs of my 30-year-old online learner who's got a job and 3 kids and feels pretty stuck and tried college 10 years before and maybe did a stint in the military and now is coming back, that person's pretty clear about what they're all about. They don't need a lot of coming of age. They need some other things. They need a model that's much more convenient because they have so little time, right? And they have so little flexibility. They have jobs and kids. So we need to be able to put in front of students more options. And I think we will see learning environments within those options that are very dynamic. So recognizing that a lot of the most effective learning takes place outside of our classrooms. So how do we recognize learning as it happens at work? Can we give credits to the treasurer in student government who manages a $3 million budget and has genuine competencies that they have mastered to do that effectively? Can we assess that? Can we give credit for it, recognizing it? So I love this idea of recognizing learning in all the places that it happens. And then in the classroom, I think we will see just really dynamic. I'm so excited about the impacts of VR and AR. ASU just had a nice announcement about some piloting they're doing around immersive learning. So I think that will be an important part of the future. And I still remain very bullish on competencies because I think we recognize increasingly 2 things about time. It's a lousy measure of learning. The fact that someone sat in a seat for 15 weeks really doesn't tell you a whole lot. The fact that we assigned them a B grade doesn't actually tell you a whole lot either. Ask any employer looking at transcripts. So the idea that we might be able to measure learning by actual mastery of rigorously assessed skills, I think is just changes everything. The other piece about that I think is really important, I've been thinking a lot about it, is the degree to which time is the enemy of the poor. Everything takes longer if you're poor, right? If you don't have a washer and dryer down the hall in your apartment and you have to go someplace to wash your clothes, it takes longer. If you don't have a car, getting food in your refrigerator takes longer. Everything takes longer. And time, with especially the inflexibility of term structures and class schedules, etc., is really brutal on poor people. And to the extent that higher education has built-in inequities, I think our time structures are one of them. I sat with a young woman who's in our competency-based degree program, which is much more self-paced, and she comes from the poorest section of Boston. She's a single mom, doesn't have a whole lot of resources, certainly not a lot of money. And she had attended Roxbury Community College and Bunker Hill Community College, right? Perfectly fine community colleges, so this is not a knock on community colleges. But her transcripts, when you look at them, are full of W's and F's. Mm-hmm. And I asked her about it. She said, she has a 10-year-old daughter who has chronic respiratory problems. And every time her little girl would get sick, which is pretty often, she would miss 5, 6, 7, 8 days of class until she recovered, which meant she missed assignments, she missed lectures, she missed exams, she fell behind. She's already working so hard, she could never catch up. And she's using up her federal financial aid. When we could put her in our program, which is not time-based, but competency-based, she could progress by showing mastery of competencies on any schedule she liked. Every time her little girl got sick, she would hit the pause button. And because she could do that and not be hurt by that fact, she'd just restart when she was ready. She would race through the program, got her BA in record time, is a brilliant woman, incredibly gritty. And yet if you had looked at her on paper, you would say, you might conclude, somebody who's just not ready for college or just doesn't have the resources or the wherewithal, which was not at all the case. What really was the case is that higher ed didn't have the wherewithal to give her a program that would work for her life. And that's the biggest message here, is we've got to be much more responsive. We have to become genuinely student-centered as an industry. We are not that today.
I hope I'm not insulting you when I say I feel like you think like a marketer. It's incredible. Even though you're the visionary leader of this incredible organization that everyone's buzzing about, I believe its success is partially tied to the statement you just made about the student, that when you said that higher ed doesn't have the wherewithal or hasn't had the wherewithal to give her a program that works for her life, right there, just that statement is worth the price of entry for anyone listening today, because right there, packed in there, is everything higher ed needs to know about how to transform. It's that customer-centric view of product development and program design rather than a me-focused, higher ed-focused approach. Now, I do know that even though I would say a majority of higher ed would disagree with you and say, no, we're going to keep doing it the old way, there are some future-minded, some innovative, some trailblazing leaders who agree with you 100% and realize that this is where the transformation is. This is the future of higher ed, but they're not quite sure how to get there because they are part of an organization that has done it the old way. So what would you say would be the first step in moving out of that old thinking and preparing our organization for this more customer-centric, human-centric approach to designing and deploying programming?
I'd have them think really hard about who they want to serve. I think institutions often say very broad things about who they serve. But in fact, if they get very hard-nosed and look at the data, who do you actually serve today? And is that who you want to serve? So I think one of the things that's been an advantage for SNHU is that we are crystal clear about who we serve. We serve the 45% of Americans who would struggle to come up with $400 for an unexpected car repair. That's who we serve. We don't want to serve anybody else. We don't, so we're not. So when you have focus, as you know, startups, entrepreneurial entities, but actually big companies and even government agencies, when they have real focus, they do better work. So we have a real focus on who we serve, and we don't get distracted from it, for good or bad. Like some people would not want to work at SNHU, right? We're not going to do certain things that people often associate not only with universities, sometimes they associate them with quality. So, having a Frank Gehry building means you must be good. That actually doesn't mean anything, except you have a lot of money.
Okay, so now you're officially blowing my mind because you just gave the textbook answer to the question, who is your target? Dr. LeBlanc, I get to travel all over the world helping organizations with growth and revenue generation. I guess in higher ed speak it would be called enrollment. The first and most critical question we ask is, who's your target? Now, most organizations that are struggling, it's interesting, can't answer that question. They'll give some vague and very large, broad, sweeping answer. The great ones tend to have a very clearly defined person and situation for which they are always the best choice. And that's the answer to the question, who's your target? For example, McDonald's will say it's people who want to treat their kids and kids who want to have fun with their meals. That sets the stage for who they want to serve and all the strategy that comes from their product development and locations and all that. Here's another one. Days In says their person and situation for which they believe they're always the best choice is people traveling by car who just need a good room for one night. And in the case of SNHU, as I'm learning today, it's 45% of Americans who would struggle to come up with $450 for an unexpected car repair. When somebody hears you say that, Doc, they may not realize how rich that answer is and how insightful it is to help an organization become fit for purpose. And without a clear understanding of the target, it's impossible to build transformational products and be fit for purpose. So I'm excited to hear you share that. Now, how did you discover this? How did you come about this target? I mean, I know you mentioned there was data, but at a deeper level, at a more existential feeling level, what fueled this discovery?
And that's rooted in mission. Like we define our mission by our students more than anything else. And look, at universities are asked to do lots of things, and you have to pick and choose what you want to be good at. We want to be really, really good at student success for that particular population. As you said, be very clear about who you're serving. The second thing I would say then is digging in to really understand the voice of your student. In other businesses or industries, we'd say voice of customer, VOC. literacy, but really understanding students and then trying to sort of map that against how you actually do your work. So if a school, for example, says, I want to do online programs for non-traditional learners, we don't really do a lot there. It's an important new revenue source for us. We'd like to serve those learners. Like, we have a genuine desire to extend our mission to those learners. But you have all of your offices closing at 4 o'clock, and you have policies that require them to come to campus. It's like, you don't understand your student. You don't understand how busy they are. You don't understand that they become students quite often at 9 p.m. There's a reason why our offices stay up until midnight, right? Because a lot of our students are getting their work done starting at 9 p.m. after the kids are put to bed, the dishes are in the dishwasher, and they're sitting at the dining room table. And when they sort of put their fuzzy slippers on to make a cup of tea at 9 p.m., they're not going to be a student for the next 2 to 3 hours. And if they run into a snag with something, is there someone there to answer the phone for them? So really being acutely aware of your student, and I'm going to channel Clay Christensen here, a longtime member of my board and a dear friend who passed away last year. But he would say, really understanding the job to be done, not the job you want to do, but the job that students are asking you to do. Do you really know that? And if you're simply saying, they want us to give them an education, then you're not digging deep enough. Like, that's table stakes, of course. But that's sort of like saying, I'm going to this health club to be healthy. Well, like, wait a minute. What does that mean? Do you want to run a marathon? Do you want to lose some weight? Do you want to be more flexible and agile? Like, we have a lot of things we can do for you. Do you want that gym open 24/7 because you work the night shift? What do you want? So go deep. Understand the job to be done. And then I think when you get to innovation, I'll channel Clay for a moment and say, be pretty clear about whether you're doing sustaining innovation or disruptive innovation, because they have very different playbooks. Sustaining innovation is playing by the rules of as you've always played the game, but doing it better. So when you bring technology into the classroom, which I would argue higher ed's done a great job of doing, that's sustaining technology. You're making the experience of the classroom better. You're introducing more capability. But if you're talking about new administrative systems that allow a student to take care of their financial aid faster and more simply over their phone, that's a sustaining innovation. You're taking the same rules of the game, what you've always done, but you're making it better. You're improving it. That's a certain kind of innovation, and that should be done within the institution. The people empowered to drive that work should be the people closest to the work. They're immersed in it. They understand what people need, how things get done. But if you are trying to innovate and create new programs, something looks very different than you've done before, something that really means you're going to play the game differently than you know how, or differently than you've been accustomed to, then I think you have to create separate spaces. So I would argue that, university presidents or leadership who are trying to do that, they really need to kind of separate a group and a team that's been well chosen for that job to be done work, give them space, buffer them from the incumbent institution, because as Clay would say, these new things will be treated like foreign tissue. The standing organization is either going to want to incorporate, oh, no, let us do that. And then what it will look like is the way they've always done it, or they'll try to spit it out. That's a terrible idea. We don't want to do that. So you got to buffer them. You got to give them safe space. You got to free them from the normal rules. You got to be patient, because innovation actually means often getting it wrong before you get it right. So you don't want them to build battleships. If you're going to get it wrong, I don't want to have to dismantle something that costs a fortune, but agile processes, faster iterations, a lot of testing, and get it right before you get it big. And I would say, by the way, we're in a regulated industry, so our work in innovation is harder. But I've argued the government should do the same, right? The Department of Ed should create more safe spaces for experimentation and not punish institutions when they get it wrong. So those would be the things that I would look at. And I just observed that the wealthier your institution, or the more status conscious your institution, the harder it is to innovate. Those are impediments to innovation. They don't help. One of the reasons that the most innovative institutions in the country are who they are is because they're not high status institutions at the start. Wow. Right? WG was created out of whole cloth. ASU was the poor cousin to the University of Arizona. We were a second or third tier local university. University of Maryland Global Campus was sort of separate from the rest of the system in order to flourish.
I'm officially going to take the number 2 spot in the Clay fan club, because just his statement that new innovations will be treated as foreign tissue is so true. It's so true all across the world in organizations, but it's really, really true in higher ed. I certainly am finding it out as I'm spending time with some of these senior leaders, and as they try and deploy innovation, how quickly they find those roadblocks and obstacles in the organization. But as those of you that are listening in, you're probably finding out a little bit into why SNHU is so successful and such an innovative organization, is growing so rapidly. It's a completely different mindset, I'm finding, to leading an organization, from this highly human-centric approach to designing plans and strategies and product, to this belief in innovation, that there's two forms of innovation, and the more important one does have to be handed off to teams of people who are insulated from the incumbent organization, who are given the freedom to fail, who are treated in what we call it beyond academics, a center of excellence, so that little innovations can be proven in a small way before they're deployed across the organization. This is your formula for success, and I hope people are unpacking it as they're listening in, all the way to this point that you just made about staying scrappy and staying small, in the sense of, we aren't the blockbuster video of the world who believes that nothing's ever going to change and they'll always rule the world. When you've got Netflix nipping at your heels, it's thinking like a Netflix, saying we want to change the world. We want to be that innovative group, not the ones saying it's never going to end, only to find out that the ride did end. This segues to the last question I do have for you, Doc, and I want you to share a little bit, maybe in educating me, on this notion, this word that I'm hearing a lot in higher ed called consensus. Talk to me a little bit about consensus and where it does fit in the higher ed organization and where it can actually get in the way of true innovation and transformation.
Yeah, so I think consensus works really well if you're doing sustaining innovation, where you have stakeholders who should be driving the work. So there, it's a sense of, I need people to own this because I'm integrating it into the core of what I do every day now. But if you're trying to do something very different, if you're trying to do that kind of new disruptive play, consensus becomes one of those ways that an organization starts to, remember I said, in the new thing will be either incorporated or spit out. That's what consensus does. It basically says, I've got 10 different offices that need to weigh in on this, or 10 different stakeholder groups. Each are going to sort of say, well, if you make this a little bit of compromise, I'll support it. Next group, this little compromise, I'll support it. And by the time you finish with the 10th office, you've now sort of compromised all over the place what you were trying to do. And that's a form of incorporation, right? That's the incumbent organization kind of pulling the new thing in and making it in its own image. They chip away, and by eventually, the thing that you have left, you've sculpted something that looks like the original organization. So everyone will be happy, it just won't accomplish your goals. This happens in government all the time, where consensus trumps deliverables and deadlines, etc. I did a stint at the Department of Ed and observed that at work, which is why if you're going to do something that's really different, it means it's going to be challenging for the incumbent organization. And they're going to fear, you're going to hear, oh, you're going to cannibalize what we're doing, or it's lower quality. You're going to hurt our brand. You're not serving who we serve. This is not our mission. You're going to hear all of those objections. You have to fend those off and look at, they're legitimate things that have to be considered at some point. It doesn't mean you don't have to consider them, but if you consider them at the front end of the process, if you look for consensus way too early, you will kill the innovation.
I really appreciate that. Doc, as we kind of sum up our time here, kind of give a state of the union, so to speak, or kind of some parting thoughts to higher ed as they're listening in. Where do we go from here? What should we be thinking about? Where should our mindset be as we think about the new normal and how we as leaders get our industry there?
Well, I think I'd observe that when the nation has had a catastrophe of the kind that we're going through right now, we've tended to reinvent higher ed. Out of the Civil War, we had the Morrill Act and the creation of our land grants and expansion of our public system. After the Depression and World War II, we had the GI Bill, what some would call the democratization of higher ed, and also the community college movement. I think we have an opportunity, and it's not one of these don't let a crisis go to waste, which can feel rather callous with all the pain in the country right now. But I would say that dramatic reinvention or rebirth often is accompanied by a lot of pain, and that's what we're in right now. So there's also, I think, an opportunity or an invitation to get really focused. What I hope will happen broadly is that, I was a first generation an immigrant whose parents had 8th grade educations. My mom worked in a factory till she was 76. I saw and lived vividly the American dream because I had access to high quality, low cost higher education, state college system in my case. And higher education for me and the kids I grew up with in a working class neighborhood was part of the solution. It was where we saw economic mobility and opportunity unlocked. It's the way we changed the trajectory of our families' lives. Today, higher education is so often cast as part of the problem. $1.6 trillion of student debt, questions about its ROI, the sacrifices we ask families to make. And if we generally do have a K-shaped recovery in which the sort of well-off do better and the disadvantaged do poorly, higher education has to get focused on the lower side of the K. We've got to think about that 45% of Americans who struggle to even come up with $400. We have to think about the sort of structural inequities of our system and the huge numbers of people left behind. I would argue that right now the civil strife we see in America is that sense of victimization, being left behind, being left out. And that's as equally true for, Trump supporters who I don't agree with as it is for people on the left who I think have a truer claim. But in all of their cases, they feel like in an inequitable society, they're getting screwed, that the game is rigged. And unfortunately, higher ed's kind of part of that game in the eyes of many. So I think, we have to rethink what we provide, for whom we provide it, and how to do a better job of it. And that starts with coming up with models that are more affordable, that restore access, and then being much more student-centered in ways that assure people's persistence. It's one thing to get people into our institutions, but that's just table stakes. That's the ante of the game. But what we do once they arrive and our determination to see them across the finish line is critical. And we're not that great at it for the most needy populations. So that's a broad and general answer, but I think the country needs us more than ever.
This has been the FutureX Podcast from Beyond Academics. You've been hearing from Dr. Paul LeBlanc as he's inspiring us to what the future holds. You are, as you're listening in, leaving us better off than before you met us, which is our mission at Beyond Academics. Thanks for listening in, and we hope you'll join us next time.